The rain came down in sheets that night, relentless, cold, and unforgiving. Jack Mercer stood on his porch, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the black horizon beyond the flickering porch light. The storm was nothing compared to the one that lived in his chest. Once a decorated member of an elite special forces unit, Jack had vanished into the anonymity of a small mountain town. After a failed mission had cost him everything: his team, his trust in the system, and the belief that he could ever be whole again. These days, his only companions were silence, whiskey, and the ghosts of men he couldn't save. Then came the sound, soft, desperate, barely audible over the roar of the rain. A whimper. Jack narrowed his eyes, stepping off the porch and into the storm, drawn by the instinct that had never quite left him. Near the edge of the road, tangled in mud and trembling from exhaustion, lay a German shepherd. Its coat was matted with blood and grime, one leg dragging unnaturally. But it was the eyes that stopped Jack cold, haunted, defensive, and pleading all at once. He hesitated. He'd told himself long ago not to get involved again. Not with people, not with animals, not with anything that could feel pain or cause it. But the dog didn't look away. It didn't growl. It simply watched him, waiting. Jack exhaled, a breath heavy with resignation and something else he couldn't name. He took off his jacket and knelt beside the animal. "All right, soldier," he murmured, as if speaking to one of his own. "You're coming with me." He carried the dog inside, laid it gently by the fire, and began cleaning its wounds. It didn't resist. It didn't flinch. It just kept staring at him, like it recognized something in him, something broken and buried. He named the dog Shadow. Neither of them knew it yet, but that night wasn't the end of their isolation. It was the beginning. The next morning, the storm had passed, but the quiet inside Jack Mercer's cabin was thick with tension. Shadow lay curled near the fireplace, breathing steady but shallow. Jack sat across the room with a mug of black coffee, watching the dog with a soldier's scrutiny. Every twitch of the ear, every flicker of an eyelid, it was all data. Observation had kept him alive once. Now it was a habit he couldn't shake. He hadn't slept, not because he was worried about the dog, but because the presence of another living being had awakened something in him. Something he'd buried alongside the medals he refused to display. By midday, Shadow stirred. Jack stood slowly, careful not to startle him. But when Shadow opened his eyes, they were alert, too alert. The kind of alertness Jack recognized from battle-hardened men who never truly came home. He set a bowl of food nearby. Shadow didn't touch it. "Not hungry, huh?" Jack said softly. "I get that." For days, the pattern repeated. Jack would speak, Shadow would stare. The only contact came in fleeting moments, Shadow brushing against his leg, or resting his head on his knee for a heartbeat before retreating. There were no growls, no signs of malice, but there was always tension, like the dog was waiting for something to go wrong. It wasn't until the third night that the breakthrough came. A distant sound, air brakes from a delivery truck, echoed through the trees. Shadow bolted upright, ears pinned, eyes wide with panic. He scrambled across the floor, teeth bared, growling in pure terror. Jack had seen that look before, in foxholes, in extraction zones, in the eyes of men who had seen too much. Shadow crashed into a table, sending a lamp shattering to the floor. Jack didn't move. He didn't shout. Instead, he knelt, arms at his sides. "It's okay," he said firmly. "You're safe now. Whatever that was, it's not here." Shadow froze, growl trembling into a whine. He looked at Jack, confused, like no one had ever spoken to him that way before. In that moment, something shifted. Jack realized Shadow wasn't just wounded on the outside. He'd seen trauma before. He'd lived it. And now he saw it staring back at him through Shadow's broken gaze. This dog had seen war. Maybe not the same kind Jack had fought, but war nonetheless. And maybe, just maybe, they could help each other survive the one they were still fighting inside. As days slipped into weeks, Shadow began to heal, not just physically, but in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. He started to follow Jack from room to room. He would sit quietly by the door when Jack stepped outside and wait. He no longer flinched at every sound, but certain triggers remained, especially loud trucks or high-pitched whistles. Jack took note of everything: the way a good soldier would. One morning, while clearing out an old storage box in the shed, Jack found a faded photograph of his old Special Forces unit. He stared at it for a long time. Most of the men in the photo were gone now, their names etched on memorial walls or buried in the silence of classified missions. He thought he had buried that part of himself too, until Shadow came along. That afternoon, Jack took Shadow for a walk along the tree line. Shadow sniffed at the wind, ears twitching, posture alert but calm. It was the most at peace Jack had seen him. As they neared the old logging road, a battered pickup truck rumbled past. Shadow stopped. A moment later, a faint two-tone whistle came from the truck's direction, one Jack might have ignored if Shadow hadn't gone rigid, tail tucked, eyes wide with recognition and fear. Jack crouched beside him, voice low. What was that? Shadow didn't move, but the message was clear. He knew that sound, and he was terrified of it. Jack's instincts kicked in. That whistle hadn't been random. It was a command, a trigger. Back at the cabin, Jack sat at his desk and opened an encrypted laptop he hadn't touched in months. He dug into old contacts, people he trusted, men and women who owed him favors or remembered the Mercer name with respect. Slowly, piece by piece, he began looking for anything that might explain what Shadow really was and who had trained him. The breakthrough came late at night. A buried file, a mention of Project Helix, an off-the-books canine operations program. No public records, no legal oversight, just a code name and a location, a now abandoned training facility in New Mexico. Shadow was no ordinary stray. He was government property once, a ghost in a program never meant to see the light of day. And Jack had just lit a match. The desert sun burned high over the New Mexico horizon as Jack parked his truck. Outside the rusted chain-link fence, beyond it stood a crumbling structure, weather-beaten, forgotten. The sign had been ripped away, but faint outlines remained. D-Unit Training Complex, the supposed heart of Project Helix. Shadow sat in the passenger seat, eyes locked on the building. No growl, no bark, just a stillness that Jack had learned to respect. A soldier's silence. Inside, the facility smelled of rot and old chemicals. Rooms once lined with cages were now filled with dust and peeling paint. Bullet holes scarred the walls. In the central training chamber, Jack found what he'd feared, a wall covered in faded photographs of dogs, each with a name, a number, and red stamps reading retired, deceased, or simply lost. Shadow's image was there too, labeled Subject R7, Shadow. Clearance red. Handler, unknown. Below it, a phrase was etched in marker: obey, survive, forget. Jack took a photo. He wasn't leaving empty-handed. Suddenly a sound, gravel crunching outside. Jack ducked and peered through a broken window. A black SUV had pulled up. Two figures stepped out, armed, tactical gear. They weren't here for nostalgia. Time to move, Jack muttered, grabbing Shadow's leash. They slipped out the back exit and made their way to the ridge, using the rocks for cover. One of the men, tall, broad-shouldered, with a scar under his eye, scanned the surroundings with practiced precision. Jack recognized the posture. This wasn't local law enforcement. This was Black Ops, the kind that erased more than they recorded. Shadow began to tremble. Jack reached down. You know him, don't you? Shadow didn't bark, but his eyes locked on the scarred man. There was a flash of recognition and hate. They watched in silence as the men entered the facility. Jack knew they'd sweep it. They'd realize someone had been there. It wouldn't take long before they found tracks. He and Shadow needed to vanish. Back at the truck, Jack drove fast, heart pounding. Whoever ran Project Helix didn't just want it buried. They were willing to kill for it. And now that Jack had uncovered it, he and Shadow were targets. Later that night, Jack made contact with Deputy Mark Dalton, an old Army buddy turned county sheriff. He explained just enough. This dog, Shadow, he's the key to something they want erased. Dalton didn't ask questions. You need a place to disappear, Jack nodded. And time. Just enough to figure out what they did to him. Dalton gave a low whistle. You sure you want to open this door, Jack? Jack looked at Shadow, curled up beside the fire, but eyes still scanning the darkness. I already did. The safe house Deputy Dalton provided was nestled deep in the Santa Fe Mountains, a forgotten hunting cabin surrounded by pines and silence. Jack welcomed the isolation. He needed time to think, to plan. Shadow needed time to breathe. But the past wouldn't wait. The first night, a distant helicopter echoed across the ridge. Shadow bolted upright, snarling, his body locked in a trembling stance that Jack hadn't seen since the night they first met. He lunged toward the window, barking wildly, as if expecting an attack from above. Jack grabbed a blanket, knelt beside him, and spoke low. "You're not there anymore. You're with me now." It took hours for Shadow to calm. The next day, Jack called Rachel Monroe, the vet who'd helped him decipher Shadow's microchip weeks earlier. She hesitated at first, afraid, but agreed to meet in person. At a roadside diner, she sat across from Jack with a file folder and eyes heavy with guilt. "I used to work for them," she admitted. "The group that ran Project Helix. It started as rehab for military dogs, those too broken for combat. But it turned into something else, something darker." Jack leaned in. "Shadow, he wasn't broken. He was molded." Rachel opened the file. Inside were grainy photos, a warehouse, men in black masks, dogs lunging through fire and smoke toward human-shaped targets. They turned the dogs into tactical weapons, not just bomb sniffers or scouts, decision-makers. They were taught to identify, assess, and neutralize threats without commands. Jack's jaw clenched. Autonomous attack units. Rachel nodded. Shadow was the most advanced, R7. But something went wrong during a mission. He disobeyed a kill order, protected a civilian. After that, he was marked for decommission. Execution, Jack corrected. She didn't argue. Back at the cabin, Jack watched Shadow chase butterflies through the high grass, muzzle relaxed, eyes soft. It was hard to imagine that this was the same creature they'd once called a weapon. That night, Jack made a decision. "We're not just running anymore," he told Shadow. "We bring this into the light." He sent the files Rachel gave him to a trusted journalist in Denver, a man who owed Jack a favor and had a reputation for exposing military scandals. But before he could hear back, the cabin's generator sputtered. Then silence. Jack grabbed his rifle. Shadow stood beside him, tense. A voice echoed from the darkness. "Calm. Cold. You've seen too much, Jack." Shadow growled. Deep low. Jack raised his weapon. "You'll have to come through us." And from the trees, figures began to move. The moonlight cut through the trees in jagged beams as Jack and Shadow stood at the edge of the cabin, their senses on high alert. The sounds of movement grew closer, sharp, deliberate steps. Whoever was out there was hunting them. "Stay close," Jack muttered to Shadow, his voice steady but laced with tension. The German shepherd stood beside him, every muscle tensed, his eyes scanning the darkness with unwavering focus. Suddenly, the first figure emerged from the tree line, a tall, shadowed silhouette, moving with predatory precision. Jack's finger tightened on the rifle trigger. He could feel the weight of Shadow's presence next to him, the dog's loyalty palpable. "Don't move, Jack," the voice called out from the darkness. It was low, dangerous. "We're not here to kill you. At least, not yet." Jack's heart skipped a beat. He didn't recognize the voice, but it carried with it the same coldness he had come to associate with the men who had trained Shadow, the men who had used him as a weapon. "Who are you?" Jack demanded, his rifle steady in his hands. Shadow growled softly, a warning. Jack had learned that the dog's instincts were sharper than his own. "I'm Wade Connor," the man said, stepping forward into the moonlight. He was tall, with a hard face and piercing eyes that never blinked. There was something in his gaze that made Jack's skin crawl. "And I've been sent to make sure that the truth never sees the light of day." Jack's mind raced. He had heard of Wade Connor, a shadow within a shadow, someone with deep ties to the organization that had run Project Helix. If anyone had the power to silence them, it was Connor, and he didn't sound like someone who would hesitate. "Why are you here?" Jack asked, his voice steady despite the rising fear in his chest. "Shadow's time is up," Connor said. He stepped closer, a grin curling his lips. "You've dug too deep, Mercer. You should have let it go. But now, I'll make sure that neither of you ever gets out of here." Jack felt Shadow tense beside him, his low growl echoing into the night. The dog knew, just as Jack did, that this wasn't going to end peacefully. "You'll have to kill us first," Jack replied, his eyes narrowing. "And I don't think you're ready for that." Connor's smirk faltered, his eyes flickering to shadow. The dog was now fully alert, its body poised like a coiled spring, ready to strike. Jack could feel the connection between them, the bond forged in hardship and shared survival. "You're making a mistake," Connor said, his hand reaching for the gun at his side. But before he could draw it, a sharp bark from Shadow echoed through the woods, cutting through the tension like a blade. Without warning, Shadow lunged forward, faster than Connor could react, its teeth flashing in the moonlight. The man barely had time to raise his arm in defense before the dog was on him, teeth sinking into his shoulder. Jack wasted no time. He fired a warning shot into the air. "Stay down, Shadow," Jack shouted. The dog hesitated, sensing its handler's command. The moment of restraint was all Jack needed to spring into action. He moved swiftly, disarming Connor before he could pull a second weapon. With one swift motion, Jack kicked the gun out of the man's reach and slammed him to the ground, pinning him there with the weight of his experience and training. "I told you," Jack said, his voice low and filled with deadly calm. "We're not running anymore." Connor's eyes flickered with rage as he struggled beneath Jack's grip. "You can't win this. You've already lost." Jack didn't respond. He didn't need to. The fight was over. Shadow had already proven that. The standoff didn't last long. Connor lay on the ground, pinned by Jack's solid grip, while Shadow stood watch, his low growl still rumbling in his throat, ready to protect Jack at a moment's notice. Jack's heart pounded, his mind racing with a mix of adrenaline and a dark sense of relief. He had finally come face to face with one of the men responsible for the horrors that had been inflicted on Shadow. The secrecy, the manipulation, the pain. "Tell me everything," Jack demanded, his voice as cold and steady as the night air. "Tell me about Project Helix. Tell me what you've been hiding." Connor's expression twisted into a smirk, but the fear behind his eyes betrayed him. "You think you've won? You don't understand, Mercer. The program was never meant to end. It's just evolved. New leadership, new objectives. You think Shadow is the only one." Jack's stomach twisted. He wasn't sure if Connor was bluffing, but he needed answers, and he needed them now. He leaned closer, his grip tightening. "What's happening to the other dogs? The ones they've used? The ones you've trained?" Connor chuckled bitterly, his eyes narrowing. "They're already out there. They've been made into tools, living weapons. You think the military stopped using them? No, they're everywhere. But you've already got the last one, don't you?" He shot a glance at Shadow. "Shadow's the key. He always was." Jack's pulse quickened. He could feel the weight of Connor's words hanging in the air. Shadow wasn't just a casualty. He was a part of something bigger, and the man in front of him had been at the center of it all. "What do you mean, the key?" Jack asked, his voice trembling slightly despite his best efforts to remain calm. Connor sneered, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The program didn't just train them to follow orders. It trained them to think, to make decisions. Shadow was the first success, the one who learned how to think for himself. He's the only one left alive who remembers how to break free." Jack's blood ran cold. Shadow wasn't just a victim. He was a symbol, a reminder of the program's darkest secrets, a secret that needed to be buried at any cost. Jack straightened up, pulling Connor to his feet roughly. "And if I let you go, what happens then?" Connor spat on the ground, his eyes flashing with anger. "If you let me go, you won't have the chance to stop the rest of them. You think you've saved your little dog? You've only begun to see the damage. They're out there, waiting for someone like you to make a move." A chill ran through Jack as the full scope of the threat became clear. The operation wasn't over. It was just beginning to spread. The military, the organization, the men behind this, there was so much more to uncover. But Jack knew one thing for certain. He wasn't backing down. "We'll stop them," Jack said, his voice resolute. "But not today. You're not walking away from this." Connor laughed darkly. "You don't even know what you're up against." "I don't need to," Jack said coldly. "I've got Shadow by my side." With one final push, Jack shoved Connor to the ground. Shadow's growl deepened, a warning to any who might try to stand in their way. The fight was far from over, but Jack had something now, something more powerful than secrets, more valuable than revenge. He had a partner, a loyal, brave companion in the form of a dog who had survived more than most people could ever imagine. The quiet of the night felt like a heavy weight pressing down on Jack and Shadow. As they stood in the stillness, Connor's figure disappearing into the distance, tied and helpless. Jack's mind churned with the weight of everything he had just learned. He wasn't sure where to go next, or who else was out there waiting to destroy what little piece he had left. But he did know one thing: this wasn't over. Turning toward Shadow, Jack gave a quiet nod. "We've got work to do, buddy," he murmured, stroking the dog's fur. Shadow nuzzled into his side, offering a small, comforting whine, as if he too understood the gravity of the situation. Despite the confusion and the fear, Jack felt something new, a sense of purpose. For years, he'd been running from his past, hiding from his own demons. But now, he had something to fight for, someone to fight for, and he wasn't going to let Shadow, or the truth, slip through his fingers. They didn't go back to the cabin that night. Instead, they drove in silence, headlights cutting through the darkness as Jack navigated the winding roads toward the town. There was one person who could help them, someone who had the knowledge and the resources to take on the people behind the operation. Dr. Rachel Monroe. Rachel had been part of the medical team that had helped Shadow back at the shelter. Jack knew she had escaped from the group Connor worked for, and her escape wasn't a simple accident. If anyone could help him put the pieces together, it was Rachel. They arrived at her small, secluded house, where the shadows of the trees stretched long across the yard. Jack knocked softly on the door, trying to keep his mind focused despite the pounding in his chest. Shadow sat beside him, alert and calm, the bond between them deeper than Jack could ever have imagined. Rachel answered the door, her face instantly lighting up when she saw Jack, but her expression faltered as she took in the serious look in his eyes. "Jack, what's going on? It's worse than we thought," Jack said, his voice tight. "We've only seen the tip of the iceberg. There's a bigger operation at play. And Connor, he's just the beginning." Rachel's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Connor said. "There's more. More dogs. More people involved. This thing goes deep, Rachel. Shadow, he's the only one who survived, and now he's the key to everything. We need to figure out who's behind all of this before it's too late." Rachel stepped aside, allowing them both to enter. "Come in, Jack," she said, her voice steady but tinged with concern. "We've got a lot to talk about." As Jack and Shadow settled in, Rachel went to her desk and began pulling up files on her computer. She had been out of the game for months now, but her skills were still sharp. She knew the dark corners of the world Jack was diving into, and how dangerous it could be. "You're right," Rachel said, turning to Jack with a grim look. "The program Connor mentioned, Project Helix, it wasn't just an isolated military experiment. It's been ongoing for years. Shadow wasn't the first dog to be part of it. He was one of the last." Jack's stomach churned. He had hoped it was just a few rogue individuals, but now it sounded much bigger than that. "Helix was a covert project," Rachel continued, her fingers tapping over the keyboard. "They trained dogs to be more than just soldiers. They used genetic manipulation, behavioral conditioning, everything they could to create the perfect weapon." Jack's eyes darkened. "And Shadow was one of those weapons." Rachel nodded, her face etched with sadness. "Yes, but the thing is, Shadow wasn't just trained to fight. He was trained to think, to make decisions. That's what made him so dangerous to the people running the program. He didn't just follow orders, he learned from them. He adapted." Shadow, who had been lying calmly by Jack's side, raised his head at the mention of his past. His ears perked up, and for a moment, Jack could see the faint glimmer of recognition in his eyes, memories of a time long buried. "So what happens now?" Jack asked, the weight of the revelation settling heavily in his chest. "How do we stop this? How do we make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else?" Rachel stood and walked to a shelf where she pulled down a thick folder. She placed it on the table, and as she flipped it open, Jack could see the names, dates, and photographs, evidence of the program's extent, its reach into military organizations and private contractors. It was more than just an experiment. It was a network of exploitation. We need to take this information to the right people, Rachel said. There are others, veterans, former agents, who can help. But we need to move quickly. If Connor's people catch wind of this, they'll stop at nothing to cover their tracks. Jack nodded, his mind already working, his instincts sharp. He had faced worse than this before. But now, it wasn't just about survival. It was about justice. For Shadow. For all the others who had been abused and manipulated in the name of power. And he would see this through. Whatever it took. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the small town as Jack, Shadow, and Rachel prepared for what would be the most dangerous move yet. The world felt on edge, and Jack could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Every step they took brought them closer to the truth, but it also brought them closer to danger. There was no turning back now. The evidence they had gathered, Rachel's files, the photos, the testimonies of those who had once been part of the program, was damning. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. They needed someone with power. Someone who could move the pieces in a way that would expose the truth and bring down the organization behind Project Helix. There's only one person left who can make this happen, Rachel said quietly, glancing at Jack. We need to get in touch with General Victor Harris. He was one of the masterminds behind Project Helix, but he's been in hiding for years. Jack rubbed his face, exhaustion and frustration creeping into his bones. He had heard of General Harris, a decorated hero in the military. His name was synonymous with covert operations. If anyone had the power to dismantle the network, it was him. But Harris had vanished years ago, his whereabouts unknown to most. We don't have a lot of time, Jack said, his voice hardening. Connor and his people are already hunting us. If we don't move now, we'll lose the chance to expose this for good. Rachel nodded in agreement. I've been tracking Harris for a while. He has a safe house in the mountains, about 3 hours from here. We can't let anyone follow us. Jack turned to Shadow, who had been silently watching them, his steady eyes reflecting the gravity of the situation. You ready, boy? Jack asked softly. Shadow's tail gave a small, determined wag. It was as if he understood everything, every danger, every step they needed to take to bring justice. Jack knew this dog wasn't just a companion. He was family. With one final glance at the town they were leaving behind, Jack started the engine. They drove through the winding roads, the moonlight casting eerie shadows across the landscape. The tension was palpable, but there was no room for fear now. They had to keep moving. The journey was long, and the silence between them was heavy with the unspoken knowledge that their next step could be their last. But they didn't falter. They couldn't. As they reached the base of the mountains, the road became rougher, the trees denser. Jack slowed down, scanning the area. Every movement felt like it could be a threat, every sound an ambush waiting to happen. We're close, Rachel said, her voice tight with anticipation. Harris's safe house is just up ahead. They crept through the forest, moving cautiously toward the hidden cabin. The trees parted, revealing a small structure, dark and isolated. Jack's heart raced as they approached the front door. This was it. This was the moment that would decide everything. Rachel knocked 3 times in a rhythmic pattern, and the door creaked open. A tall figure stood in the doorway, General Victor Harris. His face was older than Jack remembered, but his eyes still held the sharp, calculating intensity that had made him a force to be reckoned with. Jack Mercer, Harris said, his voice low but steady. You've come a long way. I need your help, Jack said, his voice firm. We have the evidence, but it's not enough. Connor and his people are too dangerous. We need you to help us bring them down. Harris looked over at Shadow, who stood by Jack's side, alert and watchful. For a moment, his gaze softened. The dog, he asked, a hint of surprise in his voice. This is Shadow, Jack said. He was part of Project Helix. He's the only one left, and he's the key to exposing everything. Harris nodded, stepping aside to let them in. Come in, he said, closing the door behind them. We'll talk strategy. But you're right about one thing. This isn't just about Connor anymore. This goes deeper. A lot deeper. As Jack, Rachel, and Shadow stepped inside, the weight of their journey pressed down on them. But for the first time in a long while, Jack felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. A real chance at justice. A chance to bring down the monster that had created him and Shadow. The time for hiding was over. It was time to fight back. The air in the cabin felt thick with tension. General Harris's presence was commanding, and Jack could tell that, despite his years of hiding, Harris was still a man of action, a leader. The walls were lined with maps, military documents, and photographs, evidence of a life lived in the shadows, in pursuit of justice for the forgotten souls lost to the darkness of the world. We've been tracking Connor and his operation for years, Harris said as he pored over a set of documents spread across the table. But they've always been one step ahead. This time, we have an advantage. Jack leaned in, Shadow standing by his side, his watchful eyes scanning the room as if assessing the dangers that lay beyond. Rachel stood across from Jack, her gaze fixed on the maps as she listened intently. "You're sure you can bring them down?" Jack asked, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "We've got the evidence," Harris said, his finger tracing a route on the map. "We know where they're hiding. We know who's involved. And now, with Shadow's unique connection to their operations, we can expose them for good." Jack glanced at Shadow, his loyal companion who had endured so much, yet had never wavered. The bond between them was unspoken but understood. Shadow had been the one to lead them here, and now they had to see it through to the end. A sudden knock on the door shattered the momentary silence. Harris's hand moved instinctively to a concealed weapon at his side. Jack was already on edge, but Rachel stopped him before he could make a move. "It's okay," she whispered. "We've been expecting this." The door creaked open, revealing two figures, Mark Dalton, the deputy who had been with them from the beginning, and a young man Jack had never seen before. The new face was wearing a military jacket, his expression grim. "We have a situation," Mark said, his tone serious. "Connor and his people know we're onto them. They're moving faster than we thought. We need to act now, or we risk losing everything." Jack's eyes narrowed. "How much time do we have?" "Less than 24 hours, Mark replied. "We've got a window, but it's closing fast. If we don't take action now, we'll never get another shot." Harris stood up from the table, his face hardening as he looked at Jack. "We can't waste any more time. We need to move." Jack nodded, determination coursing through his veins. This was it, the final chance to put an end to the organization that had ruined so many lives, including his own and Shadow's. He felt a surge of adrenaline, the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about justice. It was about giving Shadow the peace he deserved. And it was about stopping people like Connor from destroying more lives. "We're with you," Jack said firmly. "Let's do this." The next few hours passed in a blur. The team gathered weapons, loaded vehicles, and made final preparations. Shadow stayed close to Jack, never leaving his side, sensing the intensity of the moment. Rachel helped strategize with Harris, while Mark and the young soldier handled the technical side of the operation. Every decision was crucial, and time was running out. As night fell, they made their move. The group traveled in silence, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional growl of wind outside. Jack's mind was focused, his thoughts racing with the possibilities of what lay ahead. He knew there would be no turning back once they confronted Connor's men. It was all or nothing now. After a long drive through winding roads and dense forest, they arrived at the facility, a heavily fortified compound deep in the wilderness. It was an old military base, abandoned by most, but still in use by Connor's operation. The walls were high, the perimeter secured with armed guards. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as they approached. This was it. He knew the risks, but there was no hesitation in his actions. He had come too far to back down now. Harris and his team moved swiftly, using the cover of darkness to infiltrate the compound. Jack's pulse quickened, but he remained focused, relying on his training and instincts. Shadow, ever loyal, stayed close behind him, moving with the precision of a soldier. There was a quiet power in the way the dog moved, a grace that came from years of experience, years of being trained for war. The first wave of guards came into view. Harris gave a signal, and the team moved into position. Shots rang out, muffled by silenced weapons. One by one, the guards fell, and the team made their way deeper into the compound. Finally, They reached the heart of the operation, the main building where Connor and his top men were located. As they approached the door, Jack signaled for Shadow to stay behind, ready to act if needed. The dog's eyes gleamed in the dark, as if he knew the stakes. Jack's hand hovered over the door handle. The moment of truth had arrived. The cold steel door creaked open, the hinges protesting as Jack and his team slipped into the building. The air inside was thick, heavy with the scent of damp concrete and old machinery. There were no windows, only dim overhead lights casting long shadows on the walls. It felt like a tomb, a place where secrets were buried, waiting to be uncovered. Jack moved with purpose, his mind focused on the mission. He knew the risks. This wasn't just about confronting Connor. It was about putting an end to the nightmare that had haunted him for so long. He had to stop the people who had manipulated Shadow, the ones who had turned a loyal soldier into a tool of war. This was more than just revenge. It was about justice for every dog, every soldier, every innocent life that had been ruined. Shadow was a step behind him, every inch of his being alert, sensing the danger that loomed ahead. His ears were pricked, and his body was tense, ready to spring into action at any moment. They moved swiftly down the narrow corridor, the sound of their footsteps muted on the concrete floor. Harris led the way, his military experience guiding them through the darkened maze. Mark and the young soldier took up the rear, keeping a watchful eye on their surroundings. "Stay close," Jack whispered, his voice low but firm. "We don't know what we're walking into." The closer they got to the heart of the compound, the more tense the atmosphere became. The sound of voices echoed in the distance, and Jack's grip on his weapon tightened. He knew they were getting close. Suddenly, a door up ahead creaked open, and a group of armed men stepped into view. Their eyes went wide with shock as they saw Jack and his team. "Move," Jack barked, raising his weapon. The gunfire was deafening, but it was over quickly. The guards fell, one by one, and the team pushed forward. The sound of heavy footsteps behind them told Jack that they were getting closer to Connor's inner circle. Jack led them through another set of doors, into a large, open room. And there, standing at the far end, was the man they had come for. Wade Connor, the man who had been pulling the strings behind everything. His cold eyes locked onto Jack's, a thin smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Well, he said, his voice smooth, almost mocking. "I didn't think you'd make it this far." Jack's heart pounded in his chest, but he stood tall, unwavering. He had one goal now, to put an end to this. "You've taken everything from me, Connor," Jack said, his voice low and controlled. "And now it's over." Connor laughed, a harsh, hollow sound. "You think you're the first to come after me? I've buried men like you before. You don't scare me." Jack's grip tightened on his weapon. "You've buried a lot more than men. You've buried lives, dogs, soldiers, innocents. You think you can keep getting away with it?" Connor's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, there was a flicker of doubt in his expression. "You think you've won, Mercer? You're just a pawn. You always were." Shadow growled low, the sound emanating from deep within his chest. His body was tense, every muscle coiled, ready for action. Jack glanced down at the dog, his silent partner in this mission. Shadow had been through the same hell that Jack had, and now they were standing together to make things right. "This ends tonight," Jack said, his voice steady. "For all of us." Without warning, Connor pulled a gun from his side, aiming it directly at Jack. But before he could fire, Shadow lunged forward with lightning speed, tackling Connor to the ground. The gun went off, but it missed, the bullet embedding itself in the ceiling. Connor struggled beneath Shadow, but the dog's strength was unmatched. Jack moved quickly, disarming Connor and pinning him to the ground. "Get up," Jack said, his voice cold and final. Connor's defiant glare never faltered, but he knew the game was over. He had lost. Minutes later, Harris and his team arrived to secure Connor, ensuring that he couldn't escape or harm anyone else. The room was eerily quiet now, the silence broken only by the sound of heavy breathing. Jack stood tall, his heart still racing, but the adrenaline had begun to fade. Shadow remained by his side, his eyes watching Connor with a calm intensity. For a moment, there was peace, a fleeting moment of justice. A victory for the countless victims Connor had left in his wake. "This is over," Jack muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Harris nodded, his eyes serious. "You've done it. You've stopped him." Jack glanced down at Shadow, who was now sitting quietly by his side. He reached down, giving the dog's head a gentle scratch. "We've done it," Jack said softly. Together, as they made their way out of the compound, Jack felt a weight lift off his shoulders. For the first time in years, he could breathe freely. Shadow had helped him find justice, not just for himself, but for all those who had suffered because of Connor's operation. And as they drove away, heading back to the quiet life they had once shared, Jack knew that the road ahead would be different. The scars would always remain, but the bond between him and Shadow had transformed them both. Together, they had found redemption. The sun was setting as Jack and Shadow walked down a quiet road leading out of town. They had made a home for themselves in the small community, a place where they could heal. Jack had found a new sense of purpose, working with local veterans and animal shelters to help those who had been hurt by the same darkness that had once claimed him and Shadow. As the sky turned orange and gold, Jack looked down at the dog by his side, a silent promise passing between them. They had survived the worst, and now they were free. The journey was far from over, but Jack and Shadow had found a new chapter in their lives, one built on trust, loyalty, and the unwavering bond that only they could understand. Together, they were unstoppable. Weeks passed since the confrontation with Wade Connor, but the impact of that night still lingered in Jack's mind. He and Shadow had become more than just survivors. They had become symbols of resilience and redemption, living proof that even in the darkest moments, healing and hope were possible. Their quiet life in the small town had been a refuge, but their work wasn't done yet. Jack had found new purpose in the people he was helping, veterans like himself, struggling to adjust, and animals that had suffered much like Shadow. One evening, as Jack sat on the porch of their modest home, Shadow curled up at his feet. Jack thought about everything they'd been through. The scars, both visible and hidden, were still part of them, but they no longer defined them. Together, they had rebuilt not just their lives, but their souls. A knock on the door broke his thoughts, and when he opened it, he was greeted by a familiar face, Deputy Mark Dalton, who had been a constant ally throughout their journey. "Thought I'd stop by," Mark said with a smile. "How's everything going?" "Better than I expected," Jack replied, stepping aside to let him in. "Good to hear." Mark glanced at Shadow, who was lying lazily by the door. "You've both earned your peace." Jack nodded, but there was something in his eyes, a reminder that peace was fragile, always shifting. But with Shadow by his side, Jack knew that they could face anything, no matter how difficult the road ahead might be. Mark looked down at the dog. "You know, I never thought I'd see the day when a dog could make such a difference." "Neither did I," Jack said, his voice soft but filled with conviction. "But Shadow's not just a dog. He's a part of me now. We've both learned that we don't have to carry our pasts alone." Shadow lifted his head at the sound of Jack's voice, his eyes meeting Jack's in that familiar way, a silent understanding passing between them. The dog's loyalty, his unwavering support, had not only helped Jack confront the demons of his past, but had also brought him a new family, one built on trust, respect, and a deep bond that could never be broken. For the first time in years, Jack felt complete, not because the darkness was gone, but because he had learned to live with it, to move forward with the love and companionship that Shadow had given him. "I guess it's true what they say," Jack mused, as he sat down beside Mark on the porch. "The best part of being lost is finding your way home." Mark raised an eyebrow. "And you think you've found it?" Jack smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his face. "I have. With Shadow, with this town, and with the work we're doing. It's not perfect, but it's ours, and I wouldn't trade it for anything." As the sky darkened, the stars began to appear, twinkling above them in the vast Texas night. It was a peaceful evening, the kind of night that made everything feel right. Jack sat back, his heart light, knowing that whatever came next, he wouldn't face it alone. Shadow rested his head on Jack's feet, content, the bond between them stronger than any words could convey. And together, they watched as the world slowly faded into the quiet calm of a new beginning.